After Bryan Kohberger was arrested for the killings in Moscow, Idaho, former classmates and colleagues began speaking up.
After November 12th, his behavior changed significantly. He failed us all on the test, and that was in like October. And then he left, a lot of comments. And then starting November and December, he started just handing out 100s and leaving very minimal comments. So that was, I think, probably the biggest behavior change.
For months, Bryan Kohberger lived with something. Something people saw but couldn't name. Something that made women uncomfortable. Something that made them afraid. A few months later, the truth came out. The warnings were real. The instincts were correct. And 4 families will never be whole again.
Bryan seemed like he was on the knife's edge between exhaustion and burnout, and at the time it was extremely difficult to tell which was which. He did become more chatty towards the tail end of the term following the quadruple homicide in Moscow.
He probably, that I saw, he was always a little bit spotty on whether or not he'd come to class because he had, whatever PhD stuff over the top of it. But the couple times that he did come after or around that time period, I remember him, he had like a little bit more facial hair, just like stubble, but definitely less like well kept than he was. And he was a little quieter. He used to stand up at the start of class and like talk about some stuff sometimes. And this time he didn't really do that at all. He was definitely, I think, like the previous like mental preoccupation that we had been noticing where it was like, he didn't really want to be there. That was at like an all-time high. And he just, didn't look like he was doing great.
The first person to observe Kohberger's odd behavior was a professor. In a faculty meeting at Washington State University just months before the murders, a professor who specialized in working with predators made a chilling comment about Bryan Kohberger. She told her colleagues that Bryan Kohberger was smart enough that in 4 years they would have to give him a PhD. But she warned them to mark her words. When he became a professor, they would hear he was harassing, stalking, and sexually abusing his students. She made this statement before anyone outside that room knew his name and before 4 University of Idaho students were murdered in their beds just 8 miles away. By the time her warning reached beyond that conference room, it was already too late. Bryan Kohberger arrived at Washington State University in August 2022 to begin his doctoral studies in criminology. At 27 years old, he appeared to be just another graduate student pursuing advanced study in criminal justice, specifically focusing on offender decision-making and the psychology behind certain crimes. He shared an office with other graduate students, carried research papers and referenced studies from memory during class discussions. But within weeks of the fall semester beginning, female students started sharing concerns with one another. They described conversations with Kohberger felt invasive and uncomfortable, where he asked personal questions disguised as academic interest. The way he looked at women wasn't normal eye contact, but something more penetrating, as if he were studying specimens rather than engaging with colleagues. These interactions lasted just a bit too long, every single time. Female students reported that the atmosphere in a room would change when he entered, and they began to feel genuinely unsafe in his presence. One faculty member, a woman who had worked for years in criminal psychology, began paying particular attention after hearing concerns from multiple students. Her professional experience had taught her to recognize patterns of behavior that suggested attempts at control rather than genuine communication. When she observed Kohberger directly, she noticed the same unsettling dynamics her students had described. His tone when speaking to women was distinctly different, often condescending as if he believed he understood their motivations better than they understood themselves.
Physically, he would position himself in ways that created discomfort, particularly by standing near doorways in the shared graduate office space. This faculty member witnessed occasions when a female student would attempt to leave the room and Kohberger would stand near the door in a way that forced her to maneuver around him.
The student would hesitate, and something about the silence in those moments prompted the professor to intervene by entering the room and giving the student a natural reason to move past him. She developed a deliberate strategy of finding reasons to enter the office when she heard a female student was alone with him, asking questions or retrieving items to provide an exit opportunity. She told one student that if she ever needed help, she should email her with the subject line 911. The professor later stated that her maternal instinct wouldn't let her leave female students alone with him, even though she didn't have concrete evidence of a specific threat at that time. In classroom settings, Kohberger dominated discussions with what other students described as hours-long verbal sparring matches with professors. His apparent goal was to establish himself as the strongest, smartest, and most important person in the room rather than to genuinely engage with the material. His research interests became increasingly specific, focusing on sexual burglary, home invasion crimes, and the psychology of offenders who targeted victims in intimate settings. When he discussed these topics, classmates noticed he didn't approach them with academic detachment, but with a level of detail and investment that made people uncomfortable, as if he were deeply interested in understanding the internal logic and emotional mindset of perpetrators. By late August and into September, less than a month into the semester, formal complaints began accumulating. Over the course of the fall semester, 13 separate complaints were filed by faculty members, administrators, and students regarding Kohberger's behavior. The complaints detailed rude and belittling treatment toward women, unprofessional conduct, and discriminatory comments that were homophobic, ableist, xenophobic, and misogynistic in nature. In one documented instance, he asked a deaf classmate whether she would be comfortable having children given her disability. In another, he posed a hypothetical to a female student about sexual assault, asking if a woman wearing revealing clothing would bear some fault if she were raped. When confronted about his inappropriate statements, he would respond by saying he cared how the person felt, but that they were wrong. Multiple students reported that he seemed to be testing boundaries, making statements that crossed lines and then watching carefully to gauge reactions. On September 23, 2022, Kohberger had a serious confrontation with Professor John Snyder, the faculty member he supported as a teaching assistant. The altercation was significant enough to warrant administrative intervention. He was counseled about professionalism and appropriate interactions with students and colleagues. In response to the mounting complaints, the university held a mandatory training session on behavioral expectations for all graduate students, a measure directly prompted by concerns about Kohberger's conduct. After the mandatory training, some students hoped his behavior might improve, but instead he simply became more careful and calculated about when and how he engaged with people. Female students in the criminology program began implementing safety precautions among themselves. They avoided being alone in office spaces, traveled in pairs, and shared Kohberger's class schedule with one another so they would know when to avoid certain areas of the building at particular times. Text messages between students during this period contained warnings about his location and advice to stay away from specific floors of the building at particular times.
One undergraduate student in the department reported that Kohberger asked her on a date. When she declined and mentioned she had a girlfriend, he continued to pursue her despite her clear rejection. She subsequently began avoiding any locations where she might encounter him. Around this same time, a female graduate student who lived in the same apartment complex as Kohberger reported that someone had broken into her apartment and stolen items including perfume and underwear. While investigators would later examine this incident, no definitive connection to Kohberger was ever established. In October 2022, people who interacted with Kohberger regularly began noticing physical injuries on him. A teaching assistant who considered himself friendly with Kohberger observed a large scratch on his face that looked exactly like fingernail marks. On another occasion, he noticed that Kohberger's knuckles were scraped and reddened, as if he had been striking something repeatedly. When asked about these injuries, Kohberger claimed he had been in a car accident, but the teaching assistant noted that there was no visible damage to Kohberger's vehicle, which he saw in the parking lot every day. During this same period, cell phone records would later reveal that Kohberger's phone pinged near Moscow, Idaho, at least 12 times between August and November. Moscow is a small college town just 8 miles from the Washington State University campus in Pullman, home to the University of Idaho. These phone pings always occurred late at night or in the early morning hours, indicating that Kohberger was repeatedly driving through this neighboring community when most residents were asleep. His route took him through residential neighborhoods near the university, including past a white 3-story rental house at 1122 King Road, where 6 University of Idaho students shared living space. Living in that house were Kaylee Gonsalves, a 21-year-old senior who had been accepted to law school in Texas. Madison Mogan, also 21, who was Kaylee's best friend since childhood and studying marketing. Zaina Kernol, a 20-year-old junior pursuing degrees in marketing and human resource management, and Ethan Chapin, Zaina's 20-year-old boyfriend, who was a freshman in the Sigma Chi fraternity. 2 other roommates, Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funke, also lived on the first floor of the house. On the night of November 12, 2022, the roommates at 1122 King Road spent the evening in different locations around Moscow. Kaylee and Madison went to a local sports bar and then stopped at a food truck where security cameras captured them ordering food at 1:40 a.m., appearing carefree and happy. Zaina and Ethan attended a fraternity party at Sigma Chi and returned to the house around 1:45 a.m. Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funke were already home on the first floor. By 2 a.m., everyone had returned to the house, and by 4 a.m., most were asleep. Security cameras in the neighborhood captured a white Hyundai Elantra making multiple passes near the house during the early morning hours. The vehicle circled the block, slowed, and at approximately 4:04 a.m., it parked. Over the next 17 minutes, an attacker entered the unlocked kitchen door and moved through the house.
Dylan Mortensen was awakened by sounds she initially thought were coming from Kaylee playing with her dog. Minutes later, she heard crying and a male voice saying, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." Investigators believe the attacker went to the 3rd floor first, where Kaylee and Madison were asleep together in Kaylee's bed under a pink blanket. On the 2nd floor, Xana heard something and opened her door. DoorDash delivery records showed she had been awake and had ordered food. The attack on Xana was different from the others because she fought back, sustaining defensive knife wounds on her hands. Ethan Chapin's blood had seeped through the house's exterior wall. 8 miles away at Washington State University, Bryan Kohberger attended his classes and went about his normal routine. But students who knew him noticed changes. Despite his typical eagerness to discuss violent crime cases in academic settings, he remained notably quiet when classmates talked about the Moscow murders. He stopped bringing his phone to class, though he had previously checked it constantly. His appearance became more disheveled, and colleagues observed new tension in his posture and demeanor. Several days after the murders, the teaching assistant who had previously noticed injuries on Kohberger saw visible scratches on his face again, along with injured knuckles that appeared as though he had been hitting something repeatedly. When asked about these marks, Kohberger again mentioned a car accident, an explanation that didn't align with the undamaged condition of his vehicle. Approximately 3 weeks after the murders, Kohberger made a striking comment to a fellow PhD student. He stated that whomever committed the Moscow murders must have been pretty good at what they did, and he suggested it might have been a one-and-done type thing, meaning the perpetrator would not strike again. The way he delivered this assessment was not speculative but confident, as if he possessed definitive knowledge about the killer's mindset and future intentions.
In mid-December, Kohberger drove cross-country from Washington to his parents' home in Pennsylvania, accompanied by his father who had flown out to make the drive with him. Once he arrived in Pennsylvania, law enforcement began conducting 24-hour surveillance of the Kohberger residence. Officers observed him wearing surgical gloves while taking trash out at unusual hours and placing garbage bags in neighbors' bins rather than his own. He cleaned his vehicle obsessively, both interior and exterior, with meticulous attention to every surface. On December 30, 2022, a SWAT team surrounded the Kohberger family home and executed an arrest warrant. When they entered, they found Bryan in the kitchen wearing examination gloves and sorting household garbage into separate Ziploc bags. He was taken into custody and charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary. The investigation that led to his arrest had centered on 3 critical pieces of evidence. First, thousands of white Hyundai Elantras were registered in the region, but investigators painstakingly went through records to identify vehicles that matched the one captured on security cameras near the crime scene. Cell phone data confirmed that the Elantra seen repeatedly in the area belonged to Kohberger, and the same data showed his phone had pinged in Moscow at least 12 times in the months before the murders, always during late night or early morning hours. After November 13, this pattern stopped completely. His phone never pinged in Moscow again. Second, a Ka-bar knife sheath had been left at the crime scene next to one of the victims' bodies. Touch DNA recovered from the snap button on this sheath matched Bryan Kohberger's genetic profile. Investigators traced the style of knife to an Amazon purchase Kohberger had made in the weeks before the murders. Third, the cell phone data not only placed Kohberger's vehicle near the crime scene, but also documented his repeated trips to Moscow over a period of months, always late at night, establishing a pattern of surveillance that suggested extensive planning and preparation. On July 2, 2025, nearly 3 years after the murders, Bryan Kohberger appeared in an Idaho courtroom where his trial was scheduled to begin. Facing overwhelming evidence and the possibility of the death penalty, he made a surprising decision to change his plea. He pleaded guilty to all counts, 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary. In exchange for this guilty plea, prosecutors agreed not to pursue the death penalty, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. 3 weeks later, on July 23, 2025, a sentencing hearing gave the victims' families an opportunity to address Kohberger directly. Steve Goncalves, Kaylee's father, told the court that his daughter would have fought like hell because she was strong, fierce, and brave, and that if Kohberger had not been such a coward attacking sleeping victims, she would have defeated him. Scott Laramie, Madison's stepfather, spoke about how his stepdaughter always brought joy to their lives, prioritized family, and had her entire future ahead of her before Kohberger senselessly took that away. Jim Chapin, Ethan's father, described how his son had been defending Zana until the very end, displaying the bravery that defined his character, and how the family had been robbed of watching him become the man they knew he would be. Kim Kernodle, Xana's aunt, delivered a statement of unexpected grace, telling Kohberger that she had forgiven him because she could no longer live with the weight of hatred. She offered to speak with him any time he wanted to talk about what happened, without judgment. The surviving roommates also provided statements describing the lasting trauma they carried, including debilitating panic attacks and the guilt of having survived when their friends did not. Judge Stephen Hippler addressed Kohberger directly, calling him a faceless coward and expressing awe at the strength shown by the family members who had spoken. The judge noted that Kohberger had shown no remorse, no regret, and no humanity throughout the proceedings. He stated that he could not force Kohberger to explain his actions and did not believe he would answer truthfully even if compelled to do so. Kohberger was formally sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 years for the burglary charge. He declined the opportunity to make any statement. To this day, he has never explained why he chose these 4 particular victims, and investigators found no evidence of any prior connection between him and any of them. After the sentencing, more than 500 pages of investigative documents were released to the public, revealing the full extent of what had been known about Kohberger's behavior before the murders. The 13 formal complaints filed against him during a single semester, the 9 official reports specifically addressing his treatment of women, the faculty meetings where his conduct dominated discussions, and the professor's explicit prediction that he would become a predator. All of these warnings were now part of the public record. The house at 1122 King Road was demolished in December 2023. In its place, the University of Idaho created the Vandal Healing Garden, a memorial space dedicated to Kaylee, Madison, Xana, and Ethan. Scholarships established in their names now help other students pursue the futures these 4 young people will never have. Kaylee had been accepted to law school and would have graduated that spring. Madison had earned all her credits early and her degree had been waiting for her. Xana was planning a career in marketing at just 20 years old. Ethan was a freshman, with his entire life stretching before him. At Washington State University, the Criminal Justice Program continues its work of training students to understand criminal behavior, offender psychology, and the patterns that precede violent acts. Some of those students were present during that fall semester of 2022. They sat in classrooms with Bryan Kohberger. They felt the unease that he generated but could not fully articulate what they were sensing or what it meant. The professor who delivered the warning in that December faculty meeting had seen clearly what he was and what he would become. She had marked her words and tried to sound the alarm. By the time anyone outside that room heard her warning, 4 families had already been destroyed. In the end, no explanation ever came. 4 lives full of promise were taken, and the ripples of that night will never fully settle. The families continue forward with strength they never asked to develop, honoring their loved ones in the ways they live, remember, and rebuild. And in Moscow, the Healing Garden stands in silence, a reminder of what was lost and of a community that refuses to forget. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos like this.